Hey, what's going on, everyone? The Magnus Carlsen Invitational is back, and today I have a beautiful game played by Magnus with the white pieces against MVL. I chose this game in particular because Magnus chose a very troll opening, and then he was able to transition to multiple openings and get a very uncomfortable position, and then he ended up having to sacrifice a pawn in order to unravel, and eventually he ended up winning the game. So let's just go ahead and see what the game looked like. So here Magnus started with c3, and like I said, he was in troll mode for this game. This game was played in round 2, and here he starts with c3, and I believe this is known as the Zaragoza opening or something along those lines. Here MVL responded with b6, and Magnus goes for e4, bishop to b7, and d3. And we can already see how Magnus is transitioning. He started with c3, but now he almost have a reverse Philidor's position. MVL continues with e6, knight to d2 by Magnus, d5, striking in the center, taking advantage of Magnus's provocative play. Magnus continues with knight g to f3, and this is very common in the Philidor defense to have this structure here. The game continues, knight to f6, and here we go again. We're about to transition into yet another opening. Here Magnus goes pawn to e5, and after knight f to d7, he plays d4, and after c5, this position looks exactly like the advanced variation of a French defense. Here Magnus continues with pawn to h4, and I really much like this move. In a lot of situations, this pawn pushes itself to h5. Sometimes it stays there, but sometimes it goes to h5. The rook can come to h3, g3. Another idea here is to actually also put the bishop on d3, and if black ever castles kingside, for example, then you have ideas of bishop takes on h7 check with knight to g5 check and bringing this queen to h5 with a lot of mating threats on the square on h7. So a lot of beautiful plans here that white can implement. Well, the game continues, knight to c6, putting pressure on this d4 pawn. Bishop to d3, Magnus develops a piece. Again, he wants to, in the future, have some threats here along this diagonal, attacking on h7. Pawn takes on d4, pawn takes on d4, and here, a very key moment in the game, Maxime goes for knight to b4, and Magnus had to make a choice where to go with his bishop. Now, if bishop here returns to b1, which looks like a very logical move, you developed your bishop to the square, you want to have some protection of the c2 square by the knight in case some rook to c8 comes. But this would have allowed, if this bishop comes to b1, this allows bishop to a6. And now this bishop controls this diagonal and you cannot castle. And this king is going to be stuck in the center. And from here, black is going to be able to go rook to c8, queen c7, and start putting a lot of pressure down the c file. So Magnus, instead of going bishop to b1 here, he just retreated his bishop and he went bishop to e2. Now, yes, he no longer has this protection on c2, but he's going to be able to castle on the next move, and eventually he'll be able to go a3, kick this knight out of here, and be able to play bishop back to d3 if he chooses to. So here, another very important moment by MVL, he plays queen to c8. And the reason this is a good move is usually in French positions, in the French defense positions, this bishop ends up being a very bad bishop. Why? Well, because you end up putting all your pawns, you know, on light squares, and then this bishop never gets any play. And usually, white's bishop is the good bishop. So here, MVL has a very clear plan. He wants to go bishop a6 and attempt to trade this bishop that he has here. And also, with this move, queen to c8, he's threatening to go knight to c2 check. So there was no way for white to actually prevent this trade of bishops. Here, the only move for white was to actually go ahead and castle. Now, knight to c2 doesn't really work because you just go rook to b1. But since white prevented this move, he went ahead anyway with the bishop to a6, trading his bad bishop for white's good bishop. Here, Magnus continues with bishop takes on a6, queen takes on a6, and knight to e1. With this move, Magnus is preventing not only knight to c2 ideas, but knight to d3 ideas. Now, if the knight jumps to d3, you can go ahead and trade knights, and sort of unravel your position a little bit. Rook to c8, very standard. Now this rook puts itself on the only open file of the game. H5 by Magnus. As I said, these plans are very common where you want to push this pawn forward and try to create weaknesses around the king. This time, the move, since the bishops are not there anymore, is less effective, but still is something to keep in mind. Black continues with bishop to e7. Magnus goes for a3. Knight to c6. Of course, this move was not required. He could have gone ahead and played some other move because we're not really taking here because we're pinned. But Maxime decided, okay, he's just going to play rook b1 on the next move. He's going to force me to move my knight. I don't have any useful moves at the moment. Notice that if you, in this position, if black decides that he wants to castle kingside, well, this can run into a lot of trouble after a move like queen to g4 with h6 ideas threatening checkmate. So maybe MVL said, okay, I'm going to hold off on this for now, and I'm just going to play knight to c6 and wait to see what white does. Well, Magnus continues with queen to g4, again putting pressure on the pawn on g7, and MVL launches his pawn forward with g5. Now, Magnus here, of course, he's not going to play en passant because then after pawn takes, this rook is also going to be on the open h file where your king is castled, and you really don't want that. So after e5, Magnus just went knight d to f3, and now he's putting a lot of pressure on this pawn. He's attacking that pawn with a knight, the bishop, the queen. So MVL had no choice but to go h6, protect the pawn, and here Magnus went ahead and played bishop to e3. MVL continues with queen to e2, attacking the pawn on b2. And notice something here in white's position. Look at all his pieces here. They're so weirdly placed. The knights on e1, these other knights on f3, they're sort of protecting each other. This rook is trapped here on f1. This bishop is stuck here protecting this pawn. The only active piece in white's position might be this rook on a1, a very strange position. Here, Magnus just went ahead and protected his pawn by playing b4. Knight to d8 by MVL. He has a very clear plan. Queen to h3. Magnus has no useful moves. With this move now, at least he's trying to go knight to h2 and maybe some knight to g4 or queen to g4. Who knows? Trying to unravel his position. It looks extremely bad at the moment. MVL continues with in this position with f5, and of course the threat is just to go g4, winning a piece. So Magnus took on f6 en passant. Knight takes on f6, and here knight to e5. Magnus offers a pawn in order to unravel his position, in order to get some activity going. MVL, of course, accepted the challenge, took the pawn, and we had a trade of queens. But look at this position now after knight from 1 to d3. These knights that were absolutely doing nothing on these two squares, now they are on e5 and d3, supporting each other very nicely. On the other hand, it is black now who has the pieces in very weird positions. This knight's on d8, this knight's on h5. The rooks are not connected. The only good thing about this position is this rook is on the only open h file. But as you will see, Magnus is able to challenge that very quickly. After bishop to d6, he goes rook f to c1. And now white even has this at his disposal. He has the open c file for himself. Rook takes on c1, rook takes on c1. And here MVL goes rook to h7. Very clear idea. He wants to come here. He wants to challenge this rook and actually take control of the open c file, and he's up a pawn. So if he's able to play a few moves, get his pieces out, get them active, he will just win the game. But Magnus continues with rook to c8, a very important pin here on the knight, rook to c7 and rook to a8, not trading. Of course, he's down a piece. He needs to keep pieces on the board, and at the same time keeping this very strong pin on a position as well. Here the game continues, knight to f6. MVL tries to reroute his outside knight and bring it back into the middle of the board. Magnus continues with b5. Now there's this square where a knight can come in. This other knight can come to e5. Remember, this one is still pinned. So if a knight gets to c6, this one is going to be hurting for a little bit. And here MVL, under a lot of pressure, finally cracks and he goes for king to e7. And Magnus found this very beautiful combination. Knight to g6. King d7 and knight to e5, forcing the bishop to take on e5. And now after knight takes and king to e7, a very beautiful, masterful move. Bishop to d2, The idea is simple. We're going to go bishop to b4 check, and after the king comes to e8, knight to c6, and you cannot protect all your pieces. It would be game over. In this position, MVL resigned, and that was it. And Magnus is 2 out of 2. He is leading his own tournament with a perfect score, and there's nothing to say. The guy is just a monster, and hopefully he continues his good play. We all know he hasn't been in the best form as of late, but so far in this tournament, he's showing that he's bringing the goods home. All right, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the game. As always, stay safe, have a great day, show respect to your opponent. See you on the next video.